Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
One thing they always said was that if you have a Spetsnaz that comes to your home, if you hesitate, then you're dead. So what they said was, shoot first, ask questions later.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app so that you don't miss out on future episodes. During the Cold War, Sweden outwardly maintained its neutrality. However, from the 1960s, the US secretly promised to provide military aid. As part of the military cooperation, the US provided much help in the development of the Saab 37 Viggen. I speak with Benke, a former Swedish Air Force pilot who flew the Viggen. He shares his path to becoming a pilot in the Air Force, the intricacies of flight training, encounters with Soviet aircraft, and the unique challenges faced by the Swedish Air Force. I'm delighted to welcome Benke to our Cold War conversation.
My father, he was a dentist, and my mother was a dentist nurse. They used to work together during 60s, 70s. Then she started to be a stay-at-home mom and stopped working. So my dad, he continued as a dentist until we retired. I did have an uncle who was very, very interested in all kinds of gadgets and stuff like that, and also in flying. So he was probably the one who sort of most influenced me towards the Air Force. But as long as I can remember, I had always wanted to join the Air Force as a pilot since 6-7 years old or something like that. So, and we didn't have any connection to the armed forces whatsoever. Just to the normal. We have this conscript thing in Sweden at that time, and I remember my dad. He left for these exercises that I had. A couple of years in between that every Swede had to do. That was a pretty big thing back then. But that was the only thing that connected me to the armed forces at that time. Otherwise, it was just my very, very big interest in gadgets, airplanes. I remember one of the big things I remember, from this interest was to listen to when Apollo 17 re-entered the atmosphere in 72 when they landed. I clearly remember that. That is one of the highlights when I listen to the radio. But other than that, it's just my own interest for flying. I just love flying. That's really kept me.
When you were growing up, how much were you aware of the Cold War?
I would say, due to my interest in flying and aircrafts and all that kind of stuff, I would say pretty early. Not that it, in a way that, the Cold War, what are we going to do? It's not like that, but just that I knew what was going on, and it made me, I think, more interested in this, being a pilot in the Air Force. I read everything that there was to read about the other side, their aircraft and stuff like that, and also ours, of course. But you didn't really notice it in the society, if you know what I mean. I mean, we didn't have any drills for, now the war is coming and stuff like that. I would say nowadays, the last year or two is a lot more of that than it was then.
That's really interesting. And you mentioned conscription into the Swedish Army before. So were you conscripted into the Air Force because of your interest in that? Or how did you end up in the Air Force?
Yeah, the thing is that when you reach 18, that's when you are supposed to go and do these tests and stuff like that for this conscription thing. And in Sweden, it was kind of, everybody was going to do it, but it was not that you had to do it on your 18th birthday. So if you were in school, you went to university and stuff like that, you could do it when you were 25. So it was not really that strict. So you have the 9 years of elementary school, or what do you call it? And then after that, you can move on to what we call it in Sweden, gymnasium, and then after that, university. So it was my third and last year at this gymnasium. The papers, I was going to do this test, and I was 20 at the time, and I was going to do the test in just outside of Gothenburg here. And I told them that I was going to wanted to be a pilot in the Air Force, and because a lot of young boys wanted to be pilots in the Air Force, that they heard that before. So it was kind of like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, we heard you. That's good. But you're going to go to the, what do you call it, the anti-aircraft regiment just outside here of Gothenburg and become not a platoon leader, but
lieutenant.
Yes, something like that. Pretty high level when it comes to conscripts, if you know what I mean. Guys who didn't do that well in school and stuff like that, they got to be, like you said, gunner and stuff like that. And the guys who had better grades and better, they got to be these more leaders of these other guys. And I was supposed to be one of those, together with one of my brothers who was going to do the conscript. He's 1 year younger than me. I applied to the Air Force, so I did the first test in Stockholm. That was just what it called, theory, tests and stuff like that, all kinds of theoretical tests. And when you passed that, you had to come back and talk to a psychiatrist or psychological, mental, they test all that.
Yeah.
Then you did a lot of tests there to see how you performed in stressed environments and stuff like that. And if you passed that, which I did, you had to come back and do the fitness test. And those who were left were the best specimens, if you would say like that. Anyway, I was told before I did those tests, they told me that I was going to start at flight school that autumn. This was in May. And that was if these medical tests are okay, if I didn't have anything like that. So I was very happy then, of course. The problem was that the next week I was going to report in at anti-aircraft regiment. So I went there with my brother, and the captain there, who was going to be our sort of drill sergeant or whatever you can call it, told him that, I'm going to start at flight school in a couple of months. So do I really need to get all these, uniforms and all that stuff out? Because my paper is probably going to come later this week. And he probably heard that before. So he said, yeah, you need to pick them up. Okay, I did. Next day, we took out our personal weapons, submachine guns, and stuff like that. And I told him the same thing. Do I really need to take out all that? Yeah. And that after lunch, we were going to do a jog around the regiment, to get to know where everything was. The captain came to me and said, your paper has arrived. But you can join us and just tag along. So I left after that lunch jog, or whatever you can call it, and went out the doors or the gate. 2 months later, I joined the Air Force in the flight school down in the south of Sweden. So, and that was my long-time dream, to be there. And of course, I had, been working for it, both physical, but also through school. And so even if, when you look back at it, that I had been lucky to get selected, everybody that got in, you weren't there just by pure luck. You had to have something, what do you call it?
You have to be made of the right stuff, I guess.
Yeah, sort of. That's probably most people understand when you say it like that.
Yeah. When you were conscripted into the army, that must have been quite a shock to you that they'd sort of said, well, no, you're not going to go into the Air Force.
Yeah, sort of. But didn't react that much to it, because conscription and what you do in your profession later on, it's not really connected. Of course, if you don't have any plan yourself, you can, if you have the right abilities, you can choose a course during your conscription, like that's going to suit you later on, depending on I mean, if you want to work with, be a mechanic or whatever, yeah, you can probably, if you work on tanks and stuff like that, that's going to be something positive that you can have with you later on in your civilian life or civilian profession. But other than that, it's you do this year, and then it's you can do something completely different in your civilian life. But then, of course, uh, 4 or 5 years or something, you have to do this repetition month, as we call it in Sweden, where you're recalled and you have to train all that stuff. And but everybody that did this conscript, they were really, really happy to do these months, because it was meant that you met all your old friends from those days, and you had, I would say, it was more party than exercise. It was a lot of down time from the exercise, so you had to do something else to stay afloat. And then, I mean, people, yeah, they had fun. They had beer with you and ate good and just talked with your old friends and stuff like that. So it was something positive here in Sweden to do that. It's
I can understand that, getting back with, the people who you went through the initial training with, because you build a camaraderie there. I can completely understand that. When you sign up for the Air Force, how many years do you have to commit to there?
Really, you don't commit to any time at all. We had guys that came in, flew for a couple of years, and then, no, this wasn't for me, and then just left. We didn't have any contract or anything like that. Later on, they established a contract due to a lot of people left for civilian jobs in Scandinavian Airlines and stuff like that. So they were forced to give us a contract, and it was for 10 years, and then you get a lump of money when you reach the end of it. But most people that stayed that long, we had one thing that is very nice that I enjoy now, is that we get to retire about 10 years before everybody else in Sweden as a pilot in the Air Force, and we retire very well. So that is something that is worth a lot, both money-wise and time-wise. So a lot of people I know, they look forward to that.
So what age do you retire if you're a pilot in the Swedish Air Force?
55.
Right. Wow.
55. And I mean, for instance, I transferred from my squadron to transportation squadron, whatever you can call it. I flew there until I retired. And you had other guys that flew the Gripen until 55 and they retired. Other people went over to rescue, flying helicopters and stuff like that. And other went up to, the big building in Stockholm, we used to say, where all the colonels and generals and stuff like that.
The Armed Forces headquarters.
Yeah. And so it depended on what you really want to do. But most people that were flying when I joined, they were there for fly. That was their passion. But later on, we had a lot of people that wanted to fly some years, 5-10 years, something like that, and then go to the headquarters because that was their thing.
So what was your initial flight training like? What sort of aircraft were you flying, and what were your first experiences there?
We started out with SK-61, as it was called in Sweden, a Scottish Aviation Bulldog, which was a very fun aircraft to fly. I really enjoyed it. It's, you have this bubble canopy, pretty good performance. It was fun to fly. As I didn't do my conscript, I did 1.5 days. I had to do these, what we call the green weeks, which means that handling weapons, living in tents in the woods and stuff, all that kind of stuff. So I had to do that 2 months before I joined the flight school. But I did it at the flight school. So in September 86, we started the flight school. And first with the Bulldog for about 40, 50 hours or something like that. And that was really the first time. I would say most pilots probably enjoy the first flight experience when you come to the flight school. I mean, that is something you really remember, because it was a big, I mean, from not flying at all and now you fly. It was freedom, I might say. It felt like you were in your right environment, so to speak.
Did that come naturally to you? Were you naturally a pilot, or did you have to work harder at it?
I never had any problems flying, but I did have a special problem, because remember I said I always wanted to be a pilot. But when I grew up, we always went down to Austria to go skiing and stuff like that, fly down there. I always got airsick every single time.
Wow.
Yeah. And when I joined the Air Force, it was no exception. And mostly when I flew myself, no problem. But if the instructor had to do something, I especially remember when we were doing the spin maneuver. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I'm already feeling ill just hearing about it.
Yeah, we had to take a break in the middle of it, and then we did a couple of more of these. And before I could say anything, the instructor said that, "Oh, let's head back home, shall we?" Because he could see that I was starting to get white in my face. And then after a while, he asked the controller if we could get a shortcut, because he saw like me being probably ash white or something. And then on final, everything just came in the bag that I had with me. So they were discussing how to deal with this. And they had some medical things that they could do. So they talked to the doctor and stuff like that. But one of the instructors said that let's wait until we get to the SK-60, the jet, and see what happens. Because, bulldog propeller, and I mean, you have the vibrations and all that stuff. And once we got to the SK-60, no problem. After that, it was just dandy, whatever you call it.
Wow.
No problem at all. Yeah. So, but wow. I have to say, I have thrown up in all aircrafts I've flown. But I'll tell you later on what happened. So, but that was just not due to air sickness. Yeah.
Did they decide early that you were going to be trained for fast jets, or? Because I guess some people just aren't suited to flying fast jets. So how did they evaluate that and know that they were going to train you on fast jets?
The thing in Sweden was that, let's say 10 years before I joined, they recruited maybe 100 guys, and 25 of those were going to be selected. 75 was not going to be selected at all for anything. So it was kind of harsh environment, I would say. It was a complete different approach to instructing students. When I arrived, they had changed all that. They recruited, my class, we were 23, and they were expecting 23 to earn their wings. And everybody was going to fast jets. We didn't have any. The Swedish Air Force you flew fast jets until you either got too old due to medical reasons, or you wanted to join yourself, move over to rescue helicopter or air transportation with Hercules or whatever. So the thing with the Swedish Air Force was that the most experienced guys in the Air Force, that was the guys that flew the Hercules, the rescue helicopters and stuff like that. So that's quite different from other countries' air forces, where you have, like you said, some guys, cut for fast jets, so you're going to fly the helicopter instead. And in Sweden, it was sort of the other way around. You couldn't be a rescue helicopter pilot until you did maybe 20 years fast jets or 10 years or whatever it was.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, they have changed that now, mainly because, let's see, around 96, 97, they started to see that they had so few fast jet pilots at the squadrons because they had downsized, due to the Cold War was gone, that they didn't have enough pilots to fill the headquarters and rescue and transportation. So then they started with recruiting directly to these systems.
With the fast jet training, what type of aircraft were you initially training on for jets?
That was the SK-60, that twin-engined and side-by-side aircraft that Saab produced, Saab 105. I think it's a very good sort of first jet experience because you had this side-by-side, you had the instructor beside you, you could watch, look in each other's eyes and stuff like that, and you had a completely different kind of a discussion, I would say, when you could do like that. And it was a very, very easy aircraft to fly, I would say. Very gentle, and I mean, you could do some pretty good maneuvers with it, but it was a gentle aircraft. It didn't surprise you there. One thing you had to keep in mind was that, when you did the aerobraking at landing, if you did that too much, you hit the tail. So that on all the SK-60, they had a tail skid mounted just because of this. And it was used. I can tell you that. It was, but if you did it, if you were too abrupt of keeping the nose up, then you could really squash that skin. So then they had to replace it. But it was during summertime, and when we do the tactical flying, especially when we had 30mm guns hanged in pods, then it was very underpowered. So a takeoff, for example, we had to have we were flying at Uppsala then. We had 2 runways, that intersection, and depending on what runway you took off from, you had to have a certain speed when you passed that intersection. If you didn't, you had to push the jettison button that you had just up in front of you almost to release the pods to get airborne, because you had to have that speed, otherwise it wouldn't accelerate and get you float before the runway was, until you reached the end
before
of
the runway ran out. Yeah.
We had one guy who missed that when he was flying solo, and he had to tell the tower to lower we had these arresting nets at the end of the runway, to lower that. So because he was just about airborne, gears up, and then, 3 feet off the runway in the grass, trying to pick up speed, and then off to a big highway that was just coming, and people who saw him going between 2 trucks. He was so low, so it could really end up badly for him. Yeah. And then he just slowly gained altitude and then went back and landed. There was something wrong with one of the engines. But he should have aborted, of course. But that's how it is sometimes. So
were you being trained in ground attack then, or was it dogfights, or what were you doing as far as that training with those weapons?
Yeah, we did 1 year in Ljungbyhed at first, where that was the initial flight training, just, flying formation and all that stuff. And then after that, we had 6 months with dogfights and stuff like that, first tactical. And then and that was at Ljungbyhed also. And then we moved to Uppsala where this incident happened. And that was ground attack with 30mm guns and also rockets. Well, we did have, they could put in 50 caliber guns in these pods also for training purposes. And we used those for aerial targets. So the first 6 months, we trained for dogfighting and stuff like that. We didn't fire any live ammunition or anything like that. The second 6 months, that's when we got all the live ammunition, both air to ground and air to air. But no missiles or anything like that, just rockets and guns.
So it's after 2 years that they let you get into a Viggen? Yeah,
you did the first year, the initial flight training, and then these 2 tactical half-year-long trainings. And then after that, depending on what squadron you were heading for, You either went to Söderhamn if you were going to be for ground attack or reconnaissance, or if you were going to be a fighter pilot, so to speak, to fly the Viggen, this fighter version of the Viggen. Then you stayed at Uppsala and did your initial on that one there. So for 2/3 of the guys, we moved to Söderhamn and 1/3 stayed. So 5 to 6 months at Söderhamn, where we fly mostly the attack version of the Viggen, but during the initial training, obviously the two-seater version of the Viggen also up there.
What were the different types of Viggen then? What were their roles intended to be?
The first version that was produced were the attack Viggen, or air to ground, or whatever you call it. It was called AJ, and A stands for obviously attack, and J stands for fighter, or if you translate it from Swedish, in Swedish is jakt. And if you think of the JAS Gripen, for example, JAS, that is fighter, attack, reconnaissance, those 3 letters. And that says that airplane is made for these 3 roles. But the first version was the attack Viggen, and later on they had the reconnaissance version, but they had to do 2 different types. One for sea surveillance with the radar in the nose, and one with just, instead of a radar, you had cameras in the nose. So you have this sort of a strange looking nose just to house the cameras. So that was those 3. And you also had the 2-seater at that time to be able to train students like me at the time then. And then later on, about 10 years later, you had this Jaktviggen, the fighter version of the Viggen. That was, I would say, next generation of the Viggen, because that was a digital platform. We didn't have any things like that in the Viggen. It was very analog, and the outcome of the mission depended very much how you performed, not the aircraft. But once you learned it, it was very, what do you call it, intuitive. Well, it was
intuitive.
Yeah. And this computer that had the CK-37, which I think is one of the first computers in fighter aircraft at the time, which was very advanced. And it was advanced, but you had to really know what you were doing, because you had different layers depending on if it was targets or navigation points and stuff like that. So you could, after vacation, for example, or the semester in summer, and you came back, it could be, you could need a couple of flights before you really were back in the saddle, so to speak, with that thing. We used to call it playing the piano in the reconnaissance world, because that was what we was doing during our missions almost. You always you had these, what do you call it, keys, that you could press, and then you had some knobs that you can turn to the different levels, so to speak. The radar scope was, what do you call it, raw. It didn't do any, it just showed what the radar was looking at. No, you didn't have any computers that
processing
could,
of the...
Yeah, no processing or whatever. You had to do it that manually. And due to the fact then it could only present one symbol at a time. So it could show a ring, it could show a cross or whatever. And if you wanted to have a look at, okay, where am I in this square that I'm now surveilling over the sea? You had to, go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, jump between these symbols. And when you did that and you took up the target, see where they were, and calculating speeds and stuff like that, you were really hammering along that piano, so to speak. And you did that for 1 or 2 hours without thinking about it, because you had to concentrate so much on just to get everything right. But when you did get it right, and when you were, up to speed on it, it was you could do some really good tricks with it. So,
yeah. And when did this computer come into operation? What year was that?
Was in the beginning of the 70s, I think.
Right.
I don't know if it was when the Viggen first flew. I think it was a couple of years after, before it was, sort of released to the squadrons, or the full capacity of it. But I think the Tomcat, I think, has something similar like this.
Let me just go back. I just want to go back to your initial Viggen flight training. So this is September 88. You arrive for your initial Viggen training. How long is it before you fly solo in the Viggen?
When we arrived, we started with, I think it was 4 or 5 weeks of just classes, just going through all the materials, how the system works and stuff like that. During those during those weeks, we also got 2, what do you call it, carrot flights. What I mean by that is that it was just so we wouldn't, lose hope reading everything. So they gave us 2 flights in the back seat just to keep our spirits up, so to speak. Yeah. But in the beginning, they told us that we're going to get, I think it was 9 flights with an instructor, and then the 10th, then that's solo. And we said, everybody, no. We're going to need a lot more than that. But once you reached that point, it felt natural to fly solo, because it is a very easy airplane to fly. And it should be, because the more time or concentration you need to put into flying the aircraft, less capacity you have to doing what you're really supposed to do. I mean, my job is not to fly the airplane. My job is to take a photograph of a ship or a harbor or something. And if I have to make that much effort just to fly the airplane, I have a lot less to concentrate on the real job. So the Gripen, for example, is even easier to fly than the Viggen. But it was, then of course, as I said, playing the piano with a CK-37, when that stuff comes in, that's when it gets hard to do everything and fly the aircraft also.
What was the Viggen like to fly? Can you just describe a little bit more about some of the controls, what it was good at, what it wasn't so good at?
We came from the SK-60, which didn't have any hydraulics whatsoever, except for the gear, but not for the flight controls. That was the first thing you noticed, because you couldn't move the stick if you didn't have the engine running in the Viggen, of course, because you needed hydraulics. So the first time you jumped in, it was kind of something in the way, and you couldn't move it. When you were fastening all the, what do you call it?
All the straps.
Straps, all straps. Yeah. And all what you appreciated almost from the beginning was that, you could fly it with 2 fingers, this due to the hydraulics. You did have mechanical resistance that was built into the system to give you some sort of, at high speed, it takes a lot more power to move the rudders. You can feel it that I'm flying fast now because it's hard to move the stick. You had that as a mechanical thing it built into the system. So at higher speed, you got the sense that it was, flying faster. And that's mainly so you don't overstress anything, because if it's easy and almost supersonic speed, then it's easy to break the aircraft. So on the ground, it was very different to taxi from the SK-60. SK-60 was very soft, like a ship moving along very nicely. But the Viggen, due to the fact that we had these short takeoffs and landings, it was very stiff. So the first time I thought it was, the first flight I thought it had broken, because it was so stiff and all the sounds, it was totally different from the SK-60. And then of course, when they lighted the burner at takeoff, the acceleration there was pretty nice to have. And also, once airborne, what I learned, or everybody learned, was that if you kept the angle of attack at 15 degrees or lower, you could do anything with it. It wouldn't hesitate to do it, and you had full control over it. You could do it low level, or, just keep it below 15, no problem at all. So it was, and you used that when maneuvering at low altitude, for example, and you didn't have the speed you had maybe, but you knew that you could easily, if you just keep it at 15 or below, you could do quick turns and everything. And I think that's due to the way it was constructed for these short takeoff and landings with the canards, which gave it that maneuverability in low speeds.
When you have finished your training, what squadron are you assigned to?
During the first year of initial flight training down at Ljungbyhed, pretty early on, they gave us, we were 23 guys at that point, and they gave us 23 spots. 1/3 was at Uppsala, and 1/3 at Luleå, F-21, and 1/3 at F-17 in Ronneby, where I ended up. And then it was up to us where we wanted to go. Everybody that went to F-17, we went there voluntarily because we didn't want to end up in north of Sweden at F-21 in the Arctic. And the other guys, they flipped a coin to come where they wanted to be. The most people wanted to go to the F-16 and fly the fighter Viggen version. So pretty early on, you knew where you were going to end up in what squadron. So during this, when we had made the solo flight in the Viggen, we flew down to our squadron, stayed there for a week, and flew with our squadron, with those guys in the back seat, so they could, get to know us and stuff like that. So that was pretty nice, pretty fun time to meet your new colleagues and stuff like that. And then we went back up, finished the rest of the flights that we were going to make. And we were lucky with the weather. So we were finished about a month early, actually. So in end of January 89, I ended up at my squadron down at F-17. So
right, and your role is reconnaissance.
Yeah, we had two types of reconnaissance versions on the squadron. One was maritime with the radar, and the other one was, call it overland, this airplane with the cameras in the nose. And so mostly when we flew overland, we always had this 37, it was called. That was the reconnaissance version with the camera nose. And then the SH was the maritime. That was always over the Baltic then. But you could fly with a maritime overland also, but you didn't have the camera systems with them, so you were lacking a bit of. You didn't really want to use that airplane because it couldn't perform quite as well as the SF did. And also the SF, well, overseas you didn't have a radar, so you couldn't update your navigation system or find ships or whatever, so it didn't do that much, wasn't that good overseas. But during the, sort of high alert missions that we had, we always went in a pair, one SF and one SH. And the SH, then the maritime version, found the targets or whatever, and then the SF photographed with all the cameras. So we had very good pictures of everything that we saw then. But mostly overseas, then it was the maritime version. But we flew both, so.
What sort of missions were you flying? Were you keeping an eye on shipping in the Baltic, or what were the purpose of your missions?
The main purpose was to, gain awareness of what the Soviets were doing at the specific date, so to speak. So, for example, 3rd of March, this is what the Baltic Sea looks like. This and these ships, and also together with other intelligence sources, how does it, the radio chatter, how is that, and blah, blah, blah. And then you had what we call a normal picture for that day. And our mission was to provide what the ships were doing and also keep track of, do they have any new equipment? So most of the time, I mean, we had this high alert aircraft year round, and every time you got slated for one of those weeks where you were sitting just waiting to get airborne, you always knew that, okay, what am I going to see now that I'm going to be the first in the Western world to see? It could be a completely new aircraft or a new ship or new equipment on a ship and stuff like that. So it was, in that sense, very interesting flying over the Baltic Sea at that time. Because they did a lot of tests at that between the Baltic in Kaliningrad and then up in St. Petersburg. They had a lot of shipyards, new ships coming out and stuff like that. And also they built a lot of those ships that went to the North Sea, up in Murmansk. Yeah. So a lot of those ships that wasn't supposed to end up in the Baltic Sea, we always got the first look before they left. Well, they did a lot of trial runs first, and then when they were finished, then they left for Murmansk or whatever they were heading. So you had a lot of ships that wasn't destined for the Baltic, but otherwise were very interesting to see what kind of equipment they had.
Did you have any encounters with Soviet aircraft while you were carrying out these missions?
I wouldn't say daily, but one or twice a week, you always ended up, having one. At first, it was MiG-23s and Sukhoi 15s, and later on MiG-29s and Su-27s. And after a while, the MiG-29s, they didn't, or they were replaced by Su-27s all the way. So, but in the beginning, I know one guy from F-13, another reconnaissance base, he was the first one in the West who saw the MiG-29 when it was out. And I also got to turn with it. But on that note, when the MiG-23s and Sukhoi 15s met us, that was no match. MiG-29 and Su-27 with the right pilot in this flying, that was another ball game. Luckily, the Soviet doctrine at that time, and I don't think that changed it really that much, was that the air defense was missiles and guns on the ground, ground to air. Mm. And you always used the airplanes that was led by a radar operator to fill in the gaps. And these pilots were trained to don't do anything else. They just follow the orders from the radar controller. The good thing was that they could surprise you because they didn't initiate their radar lock on you until they should fire, really. But the other side was that they weren't really that good in when you sort of turn and burn with them. Some guys were, and they were allowed to turn with us, but others, they didn't do anything. Just flew straight and then headed home. So it was, but they were always up, keeping an eye on us, the reconnaissance, because we were all over the place during those years to keep track on everything that was going on the surface there.
And were you flying with weapons on the reconnaissance aircraft?
No, not at all. In wartime, we could carry sidewinders for self-defense, and also ECM pods, chaff and flares, stuff like that. But during peacetime, we had nothing. It was just our own flight experience. I hope for the best, so to speak. But it never came. I never experienced anything that was threatening, so to speak, directly at me. I had one incident when a German Navy tornado their territorial borders outside of the Kaliningrad. And at that time, the Russians had either you force it to land in Russia or the Soviet Union, or you shoot it down. So immediately when they noticed that they had been on the wrong side of the border. They headed home quickly. And soon after that, Su-27 went after it. And I was just north of that incident when it happened. So I got orders from our guys that I should return immediately, because you never knew if they would shoot at anything they could find, no matter what. So that's the closest that I got to being sort of in the crosshairs. The German Navy, I think they were a bit more aggressive than we were in their flying towards the borders. We could go just up to the border if we needed, but often we stayed 10, 15 kilometers outside just to be on the safe side. Because you didn't want to, call it, stress them too much.
Were you also picking up signals intelligence on these flights as well?
Yeah, we had antennas. If you look at the Viggen, on the almost at the sort of wingtips, you have two forward-facing antennas and stuff like that. That's where you pick up all kinds of radar signals and stuff like that. And we also had recorded those in the SH, where we had the capability to do that. And that was in conjunction with Swedish Navy. They had ships, or ship, I should say. They also was collecting all these signals. And then we had on the mainland, you had all these listening stations where they were listening to whatever they could find. The things that we could provide that was important for us was that we tried to lure the anti-aircraft missile sites that was along the coast to lock on to us. And then we could see how far can they follow us, and how, both in altitude and range and stuff like that. And that information, that's what the wizards could use later on to program the ECM pods and stuff like that. But when the SA-10 came, that was like when the Su-27 arrived. It was not that fun anymore because that was a big upgrade for them. And but nowadays,
so this was the SA-10 ground-to-air missile, yeah. Yeah.
The SA-3, I think it was. That was our threat at that time from the mainland. Ship-wise, it was the SAN-4, I think it was. And so during these exercises that we had when we were training with the maritime version, then we just had to keep out of the range for those to be on the safe side. But otherwise, if we get back to the intelligence, all this intelligence gathering thing was one part of this normal picture of the day. What's happening. And the one thing that I don't think many people know is that, for example, if you were going to do something, but you want to stay as normal as possible, when it comes to radio chatter and telephones and all whatever, it's really, really hard not to change something that makes the other part suspicious. It's very hard to keep it up. So it's good to listen to how the normal picture sounds, if you know what I mean.
You don't want to make a move that makes the other guy think that this doesn't, therefore they get suspicious. Yeah. Did you hear stories from some of the other pilots of their encounters with the Soviets?
Yeah, we had one guy who happened to become my, fitness instructor during my first year at Ljungbyhed in the initial training. He became famous for that incident. The Soviets, they're going to have a big amphibious assault heading from St. Petersburg down to Kaliningrad, where they had beaches where they were going to land. And then they had this big, massive convoy of ships going down. And he was out there, maritime patrol, and navigated through this. He didn't see anything especially interesting at that time, but then it was between the Soviet mainland, the Baltics, and on the other side he had this big naval force between him and Sweden. And out came two Sukhoi 15s to have a look at it. And in the Swedish Air Force, there was, I think they were stationed at Vainode, an airbase in the Baltics. And the Russians had a squadron that was, the Swedish Air Force kept very close eye on, because those pilots were pretty, what shall we say, they flew very dangerously. And I think, and that's what we were told, that they were there to sort of fly dangerously and hopefully scare us to keep away from them, so to speak.
They flew very aggressively.
Yeah, not very good, but they, did very dangerous maneuvers close to you and stuff like that. So if something happens and you hit something, well, then they didn't care really. But it was obviously for you a bad day. We had a call sign for those, or a code word for those, that we could get from the radar controller, that you have this at 12 o'clock, distance 50, heading your way. And then we immediately turned around. And so we didn't want to have any interaction with them at all. And at this time, two of these guys came out and they started. One was placing him, 6 o'clock, where you don't want anybody else, that you don't want your enemy behind you. So he started to turn, of course, and a couple of turns later, he was sort of satisfied with not having them at his tail anymore. But he thought that he was going to head home because the mission was over at that time. So we were very, I would say, proficient to fly at very low level and high speeds, the reconnaissance squadrons, because we were constantly training for that, because that was our main defense for anything, high speed and low level. So he did sort of a dive down to the water and started heading home. And you could see in his mirrors that one of the guys followed him and hit the water behind him. So he went straight down in the Baltic Sea. And from what we heard, because they were listening on all the radio chat and stuff like that between the ships, that they thought that he had shot that Sukhoi 15 down. So the ship started to locking their firing radars on him. So he was, as he said, he was going as low as he dared and well above Q for the Viggen. So that was maybe 1.3, 1.4, something like that, Mach.
Wow.
And just heading home. So that was a pretty close call between, I mean, it could have ended if somebody shot at him and he got hit or something like that. That could have been some diplomatic, what do you call it?
Yeah, an international incident.
Yeah, something like that. Because he didn't do anything aggressive to sort of lure that guy down. Because why he followed, nobody knows. But he went straight down and no parachute. So that was it. Yeah.
Wow. Can you remember the first time you came across Soviet aircraft? Can you remember that very first time that you saw?
It was one of my first time that we were heading to the other side. And I was number 2, of course. I was very green, as we say in Sweden. And I have the experienced captain in the other. I was in the SF, the photo reconnaissance version, and the other guy was in the maritime. And we had checked our square that we were assigned to. And then we started heading home, and suddenly I see this Su-27 coming up on my right side. And he was led there by the radio controller, totally quiet. We didn't hear anything on our radar warners or whatever, or radar receivers. And I told my leader that I have a Su-27 here, and I was green. We hadn't done any much maneuvering with the Viggen at that time. So I just kept on flying straight, and he turned around, and the Su-27 turned also, and they turned and burned a bit. And then the Su-27 and headed home, we thought. But we continued home. And then I saw him coming back on my mirrors. And I said, I want to have a real close look at him. So just before he was going to sort of, stick to me information, I took idle and speed brakes off. So he overshot me, came up sideways, and his huge speed brakes that has on the back was out. And it was, wiggling a bit. We looked at each other, and then he just banged 90 degrees to show his belly where he had these 6 missiles hanging. And then he just turned and went straight home. That was my first encounter with it. And it was, I wouldn't say scary or something like that, but it was, you got a bit of pulse because you realized, the severity of the situation, so to speak. That it's not just fun and games and stuff like that. It can be serious.
This is for real, yeah.
Yeah, precisely. So
wow.
But it was, I would say, of all the encounters I had with other aircrafts, the ones that was most polite, that was the Russians. I mean, there were never any aggressive moves or anything like that, except for these guys that I was talking about. But the ones I met, they were always, coming outside, they waved a bit, and I waved back, and then we just parted. But met a couple of German Phantoms a couple of times. They didn't want you there. Let me say like that. And I had one, the German Tornado also, that I came up to from the back. They knew I was there though. And then just suddenly they turned into me, just in front of me. Probably just to show that we don't want you there. So, but other than that, I didn't have any, any big encounters on that, like the Sukhoi 15 that went into water and stuff like that.
The Swedish Air Force is quite famous for the fact that they've got this Roadbase system. Did you have to practice landing on civilian roads and taking off and dispersing to other locations?
Yeah, our peacetime bases were not our wartime bases. In case of, imminent threat or something like that, we should go to the base, and then we would disperse to our wartime bases. And that was these road bases all over the country. And first we had a road base that was painted on the runway at F-17, where you could practice without, landing on the road, stuff like that. And we did that regularly. And then during exercises, we mainly used the normal runway. Every base consists of a normal runway, which is 2 kilometers long, and just like a normal runway. And then connected to this via roads, you have these 3 to maybe 5 pieces of roads where you could use also, and taxiways between all this stuff. So you could land at one road, for example, taxi it off and get refueled, blah, 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 and then taxi to another road and take off from that. Very good system, I would say. It was very good for dispersing the Air Force that way. And it was the first time when we practiced landing on those. You understand why a normal runway has a lot of grass by the sides, before the trees start and stuff like that. Because these road bases, I mean, you have 5 meters maybe on each wingtip where the trees are outside of the road. So it's very, very narrow and short because it's 800 meters. Then the road base or the runway that's embedded in the road, so to speak, we have, I think it's 17 meters wide. And then at the end, it starts to tapering off to the normal width of the road. But the strip itself is 800 meters long. And it was the first time you headed for one of those. It was very, very narrow. But you knew you could do it. I mean, yeah, it was fun also. very fun, because it was something it was not something you did every day. And normally when we were on exercises on those bases, the reconnaissance squadron, we operated from sort of behind, should we say. In Sweden, we call it the high alert. What do you call it? High alert places where, you had the fighter versions standing on.
Yeah, we'd call that like quick reaction alert, QRA.
Yeah, precisely. They were standing, just beside the runway, ready to just taxi out and go. But as a reconnaissance, we didn't have that quick reaction time at the so we were dispersed in the woods. So we had to taxi quite a bit to get to the runway, or a road base, or this shorter runway, depending on how the weather and stuff like that was. All these short runways, they didn't have any landing systems or lights or anything, so they were usable during daylight and in, I wouldn't say pretty good weather, but you had to have weather so you could fly there and make a low-level circuit and land on it. So you had to have VFR, let's put it like that. But the main runway, that you had all the lights and instrument landing systems and stuff like that. So
yeah. And these road bases must have been quite limited in terms of servicing and, looking after the aircraft as well.
Well, not really. The road bases, they were equipped with everything, because the peacetime bases, they were not going to be used during wartime at all. No facilities or whatever. We had, for example, one time when one guy was taxiing off and then out, back in the woods, and he met one of the military vehicle, jeep of some sort, and they had these parking spaces beside the taxiway where they could drive in and the aircraft could pass, and then they can continue driving. What they didn't think about at that time was that this particular vehicle had an orange beacon light sticking up behind.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the guy who was taxiing was taxiing quite fast. So he cut that fixture that was holding that light just above the roof of that car. And the conscript who was sitting there, he was kind of, oops, that was close. But that was obviously not very good at all to destroy an aircraft. It had quite a sort of gash in the forward part of the wing. But pretty immediately, everybody said, "Oh, great, we can make a wartime repair. Perfect." And then they had to do, train on that. So when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade.
Yeah. So just so I understand how these road bases work. So basically they were part of the civilian road network that have been widened to allow it to be a runway, and near to them were all the facilities you would need as for an airfield. So in the woods around them, there would be all the airfield facilities that you'd require.
Yeah, and then you have to keep in mind then that the Swedish Air Force was built on, aircraft being serviced by conscript, and everything should be easy to fix, changing an engine or something like that. And that's what they did out in the field. They changed engines and stuff like that. You had special, places where you could put the aircraft and make an engine run, for example, before you sent it off. And everybody was, in tents and stuff like that all over this big, huge base. And then, of course, in the perimeter, you had these defense forces if they were coming, other guys, the enemy, something that wanted to infiltrate or something like that. And so the base itself on that level, you could say it was self-contained, or, it had everything it needed. For example, all the ammunition, missiles, bombs, rockets, ammo for the guns, and everything like that was dispersed in the woods during peacetime all over Sweden. And that's why we dispersed out to the road bases, because that's where we had all our equipment. Peacetime, if you wanted to, for example, load up with missiles or anything like that, Well, then you had to go out to the woods to pick up the missiles and then take them to the airbase instead of dispersing the airplanes. And when you get there, you open up these storage where you have all these things and you start loading them up.
Surely these road bases would have been quite obvious from satellite surveillance where they were if they were slightly widened bits of road.
Yeah, I think first you have to keep in mind that the Base 90, that was the latest version of this system, was based on Base 60, which came in the 50s and 60s when satellite surveillance wasn't that widely used in that sense. But of course, later on, it was not very hard to pick up these road bases. But then it became even more important to have a lot of these road bases. And also the airplanes were dispersed all over this place. You had a lot of these things, so to lure the enemy, that it was an aircraft, but it was just inflatable.
Oh, right. So dummy, you'd have dummy airfields as well and dummy aircraft.
Dummy aircraft, stuff like that, yes. But of course, if you had, for example, if you had today's weapons with that precision and I would say a good delivering system, well, then probably most air bases all over the world is not going to be safe.
I wanted to ask you about survival and escape and evasion training. Were you given any training in the event that you were maybe brought down behind enemy lines?
Yeah, we started actually at the initial year at the flight school, not as trying to evade, but we were the sort of the enemy. So we were hunting the guys that were a bit older than us. And then you got a sort of sense how it was. And later on during our year, we were the guys who were evading our younger colleagues, so to speak. So that was the first we had. We also started with parasailing. Because if you ejected, everything is automatic until you have open canopy. So you really you don't learn anything to make a real, jump out in an airplane and, open the chute and stuff like that.
Parasailing is the nearest you can get to bailing out or simulation of it. Is that what you're
precisely.
saying?
And it was pretty easy because they took a car and then just dragged us up, and then we disconnected and we learned to land. That was the sort of the hard part to start with. But later on we had a fatal accident connected with that, so they stopped over land. And after that, the Air Force only did it over water, which is fine, no problem with that. So that was the sort of the training for in case of ejection, stuff like that. Otherwise, we started pretty slow, learning to use all the material that you had with you when you ejected, because the cushion you sat on in the ejection seat, that was a pack with, all the things you had with you when you ejected. And that was everything from, medical stuff and things like that, to comb and everything you could need, depending on where you were in the Arctic or in the water and stuff like that. And you also had your dinghy, the inflatable dinghy in that thing there. So if you landed over water, you had this one-man dinghy. And most would train you using this dinghy. They kicked us out in the sea, and you had to, get on board in the dinghy and start to remove the water from it, because it was full of it, and then make it comfortable, because you could be laying there for a couple of hours before the chopper came and picked you up. And in one instance, I really got the feeling for these guys that were winching down to get us. These, what they are called in English. The rescue swimmer that's going down with the cable.
Oh, the diver, yeah.
The diver, yeah. And these was conscripts that were doing that. And at one time we had helicopter 4, this with twin, what we call in Sweden the banana helicopter. I think it's called is it C-47? not the Chinook. Oh, well, it doesn't matter. After 5 of us had been lifted up, they had to change diver because he was totally worn out. And it was not because he was in bad shape or anything, but it was that hard for them to. One funny thing was that we were taught to, when the rescue diver comes to you, you do not help in any way. You are just a mannequin. Just lay there, let him do exactly everything. Don't do anything. And okay, yes, sure. So you were laying there in your dinghy, and he came up to us and he put the sling around you and stuff like that. And when they were starting to winch, I wasn't thinking, but I used my hand to grab onto the wire, or trying to. But immediately he was there and just, sort of quite forcibly removed my hand from it. And then I realized, okay, I'm just hanging here. I'm dead, sort of. And that was just because if you started to help, he didn't know what you were going to do. And that's when things can go wrong. So, of course, you just hang there like a dead fish or whatever. So that was quite interesting. And then we did that maybe at least once a year. Then with maybe every 4 or 5 years, something like that, we had Arctic training. We had one initial Arctic training that was for a week up in north of Sweden. That was, you were kicked out and they told you to survive, see you on Friday. And then off they went. And then it was your time to, dig a hole in the snow and get comfortable. And the really interesting part is that if you do everything right and you dig yourself into on the right side of a sort of a cliff, it can be pretty comfortable in one of these things. You have the inflatable dinghy that's, isolating you from the cold, from the snow and stuff like that. You make your own, your own sleeping bag with a parachute, for example. That is, and I mean, when you do that right, that sleeping bag is warm. I can tell you that because it has so many layers of air in it. So you can get really comfortable, and it could be minus 30 outside and it could be plus inside there because of your own warmth. And the only thing you had to make sure was that you had a hole in the snow, in the ceiling. You had to keep that open. Otherwise you could suffocate due to CO2. You had to have something that vented out. But other than that, it was quite comfortable. Except for the cold, then I don't like the cold. I'm more like it more down in south of Sweden. Yeah, that was the sort of the training you did for survival training. And we had instructors. We had a very good instructor that he was from the army. He was very good at instructing for survival in the wild. So he learned you to make tea on cones and stuff like that. They could almost like a MacGyver, but in the wild. Yeah. But then we had these escape exercises where you had been shut down and you had to either try to get to your own lines or just to evade long enough so you're not interesting anymore to interrogate. That was the main goal, so to speak. And I remember one of these, they dropped me off on a golf course with a helicopter, and people just watching, what the heck is that? And I was off in the woods. And then we had to...
So they're playing golf and you're just suddenly dropped onto this golf course?
Yeah, and they did that. We were...
Brilliant.
20 guys or something, and they spread us out over a big distance, this chopper. Then we had to head, at that time we had 70 kilometers that we were going to walk until we were home, so to speak. And this was on Monday. On a Friday we were going to be, traverse, or is it traverse that distance?
Yeah, traverse that distance, yeah.
Yeah. And then the enemy, that was military, of course, but then the civilians, the police, customs, stuff like that, they saw this as a great opportunity to train their dogs and all that stuff. So they were in on it too. So you really felt that you were chased, if you know what I mean. And especially if the dogs...
being hunted.
Yeah, being hunted. Yeah, precisely. And during this, my first night there, I was climbing over, when I just chopped down trees and stuff like that. So it was very kind of hard and it was in the middle of the night, pitch black. I just had this little flashlight. And suddenly I heard woof in front of me. And I just dove down and said, how the heck could they find me? But that was not a reindeer, a deer. They had they almost sound like dogs, these calling sounds when they want to mate. So that was what it was. It was not the dog, so they hadn't find me that time. But anyway, I was kind of lucky because I was never caught until the last day. That last night, I happened to stumble across a colleague, so we ended up walking together or making our way to the final place. And I remember we were laying at the road, just waiting to see if we had any movement, something like that, just waiting, and maybe half an hour or something like that. And then we hastily just moved over the road and into the woods on the other side. And then we kept going, and it was very harsh terrain. You couldn't really walk. You had to climb over, roots and stones and all that stuff. And when we were almost at the finish, we had a time where we were after that time and we're there, then we are free, so to speak, or we have made it. So before that time, we still could get caught. So we stopped a couple of 100 meters before, and just because we were a couple of hours early. So I remember we were very tired, so we lay down on the grass there, and I put a map over my head to see if I can get some sleep there. And then suddenly I just woke up. Somebody rips off the map, and I just stares in the barrel of an AK-5. And then that found us, dog patrol. And what we didn't know was that about 30 minutes after we had passed over the road, this patrol came on that road, and the dog obviously immediately alerted that somebody passed here. So they went after us, of course, and almost running over this place where we had, climbing and stuff like that. So when I looked at them and saw their uniforms, I thought it was kind of an odd color because it was a bit darker than it normally should have been. And then I realized they are soaking wet of sweat because they had been running all this that we had been, yeah. But anyway, they caught us, but it was almost, end of exercise. So they just put us in their car, and later on they came up and drove us to the finish line, and turned us over.
Right. So you didn't have like a mock interrogation, because certainly with the Royal Air Force they sort of simulated interrogations. Did you experience that at all?
At those exercises that where I were, we didn't. We had what do you call classes of it, of course, but those guys who got that training that you described, that was, for example, the guys that flew the G4 and G5 in the Air Force, went down to Afghanistan and stuff like that. They got this interrogation training up at Karlsborg, Special Forces. Well, Special Forces, they were doing all this. And
right.
But we in the Air Force, I think they changed that, so everybody gets this treatment, so to speak, now. But at our days, we didn't have that, and I really don't know why we didn't get that at squadron level, because would probably been interesting to have been.
Well, maybe you should be grateful you didn't have that.
Yeah, in that sense, yeah.
Was there a concern in Sweden about Spetsnaz and Soviet special forces trying to attack the airfields?
As I described in the airbase, the perimeter, you had special forces operating in that area, keeping all these guys out in wartime. And as you might know, we had a lot of problems with Soviet subs in the 80s, this mini subs and all that stuff, and Frogmen and stuff like that. And a lot of those missions was to map out all the surveillance equipment that was on the seafloor, We had mine stations surrounding all the big inlets to Stockholm, for example, that they were mapping out where the mines were and how they were going to, stuff like that. But then they also had these special forces that were targeted to take care of us pilots in the Air Force, because we were considered one of the main reasons for the Air Force in the armed forces was to give the country enough time to mobilize until you had amphibious assault or something like that. So that meant that if you could dispose of the Air Force on the ground already, then you didn't have to do it in the air. So they had, and we know this for sure, that they did. They kept an eye on us where we lived, so they probably the night before could take care of all the pilots, or most of them. And the Swedish weapon laws is very, very strict. It's very hard. It's not hard to get the license, but it's very hard regulations on how to store your guns once you have a license. You have to have a special weapons,
like a safe.
Yeah, like you say, weapon safe. Yeah, precise and stuff like that. But we pilots, we were ordered to have our handgun weapon we had, to have it at home, and we were not supposed to have it in the safe. The only thing we were supposed to do was to divide it in 3 parts: magazine, and then I think it was upper and lower receiver. So it was very easy to just put together if you needed it, because in case of a threat happening or something like that, we're supposed to sort of shoot our way to get to the airbase. Then, of course, we had the Swedish safety police, the military police. They all had, instructed us how to behave and stuff like that. And one thing they always said was that if you have a Spetsnaz that comes to your home, if you hesitate, then you're dead. So what they said was, shoot first, ask questions later. And that was the accepted environment for us. We had these, in Sweden we call them tavelförsäljare. It was students that were from the Eastern Bloc that were selling paintings and stuff like that those were used by Spetsnaz to check if they got a picture, knock on that door, see if the guy who opens is the one in the picture. Then they know that guy still lives at that address. And we had guys that sometimes you had a student that was selling pictures. So, but then they went from house to house to house, blah, blah, blah. But then you had these guys that just went to your house and then to a car and then drove off. And then you knew it was one of those. So sometimes we had this squadron that one colleague had one of those last night, something like that. And they started, it was almost like down here at F-17, they checked on us, and then they moved on to another airbase and another. So when the first sort of wave came, then you could alert everybody. So everybody in the Air Force was, on high alert that now are these guys coming again and checking. But we never had any incident of it, so we didn't get to see if it was real or not. But the Swedish society is very, very open. That means that we can't, arrest these people without evidence or anything and check on them and stuff like that. So we couldn't really do anything about it except just keep an eye on them. But that was pretty.
Wow.
That was real, if you know what I mean. That's
very real. You mentioned earlier about the encounters with the West German Air Force. Did you have any encounters with any other NATO military aircraft?
German, Danish, of course, Finnish. Finns not so much down in, as we operated mostly in south of the Baltic Sea. Danish, of course, because we were sometimes patrolling just outside their territorial waters, south of Sweden. And also they have Bornholm, south of where we were based. So pretty close. And during that time, we had American aircraft, Viggen aircraft that came in sometimes. We did have the SR-71, of course, when they did their tour around the Baltic Sea, so to speak. But I only heard the radar controller when they told them, you have the sled now passing over you, but you never saw it anyway, so it was so high. But other than that, I would say at that time, mostly German Navy, I would say, and occasionally some American aircraft. But other than that, we didn't see that really that much, except for the Russians then. And I would say that's one part is probably that we were operating on low level most of the time, and our mission was to surveillance, surveil that area. So what happened 8,000 meters above me, that wasn't my mission at the time. You didn't need to know that,
and you wouldn't even see them.
Yeah, precisely. Sometimes we could get a question from the radar controller because of something that, are you able to do an identification of aircraft there and there? Then you quick fuel calculation, stuff like that, and then sure. And then he vectored you towards that because he wanted to. Most of the time, they already know what it was, but I wanted to have the confirmation of it. So you just passed it and said, it's this, or RC-135 or whatever. Yeah, okay, thanks. And then it was nothing more to it.
The episode extras, such as videos, photos and other content, are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.